Welcome to Silvicast, the podcast about all things silviculture. My name is Greg Edge.
And I'm Brad Hutnick.
And we are both silviculturists with the Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry and your hosts for today's show. Brad, what you eating?
Well, it's delicious. You want to try some?
I know how this goes.
Oh, here we go. Here we go.
First, you need to tell me what it is.
I always have to tell you what it is. You don't trust me.
Yes.
You don't trust me.
No, I don't. Tell me what it is.
That's so sad, Greg. Anyways, you know what? Let's just skip right past that. If you want to know, or if you must know, it's Japanese knotweed.
I take it you've pickled it. It's in jars, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. It's not just knotweed shoved in a jar with some water.
Yeah. You'll get that next time, Greg. After this conversation, next time you'll get that.
Last week you were trying to sell me on pickled purslane, which I did try, and I will admit it was pretty good.
Yeah. See, it was good.
But this week it's pickled knotweed. I don't know. I admire your tenacity in trying to eat weeds, at least the invasive kind.
Oh boy.
So just for that, I'm going to give it a try. So give me some.
All right. Well, here you go. And, pretty tasty, huh?
It's sort of chewy, stringy.
But you.
I imagine this is what my 6-weight might taste like if I had to eat it.
Well,
if I was on an episode of Alone and starving.
I should have known better. I should have known better. It's that white bread that you're eating every day. It's just, you go to the grocery store, you're like, hey, give me something that looks like fruit, but might not be fruit. It's just, you're just into that. But this is the bounty of the field and forest, my friend. This is manna from the woods, from wherever.
I don't think.
In fact, if you think this is good, hey, check this out, what I've got going in the back here.
Okay. What are you doing back there? It looks like it's sort of tilled up.
Well, that's right. That's right. This is forest farming, my friend. See those beds? So I've got some cultivated beds there.
Yeah. Yep.
The ones on the right, that's for ginseng.
Okay.
That's because someday we're going to want that. And then not a lot of people eat those, but I like hog peanuts. So we got a bed of that in the middle there. And
I heard they were high in protein.
Yeah, well, they're delicious. Maybe not to you, Greg, because you you might need some styrofoam to eat and think it's good. Yeah.
I'm eating Wonder Bread. Yeah. And what's the bed over on the left?
Yeah, that's potatoes. And trust me, yeah, that's not a good choice.
Probably not in the forest. No.
No.
Yeah. Well, Brad, I admire your efforts at forest farming, but it sounds like you need some expert advice, and it's a good thing because today on Silvicast, we're having a conversation with Eric Burkhart, teaching professor in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management at Penn State University. Eric specializes in forest farming and just may be able to give you some pointers on those plants you're growing. I would say minus the potatoes. I think that's your Central Sands farmer showing.
Yeah, well, I couldn't call myself a pointer if I didn't try. This season of Silvicast is brought to you by the Nelson Paint Company, McCoy Construction and Forestry, and the Family Forest Carbon Program. You make the Silvicast world go round, so thank you. Eric Burkhart, welcome to Silvicast. For our listeners, tell us a little bit about who you are, where you are, which I think people will really be interested in, and what you do.
Good afternoon, Brad. My name is Eric Burkhart. I'm a teaching professor here at Penn State University and currently the faculty chair for our forestry program. I'm located here in wonderful Happy Valley, central Pennsylvania, where our main campus is. I've been here for about 22 years as a teaching instructor of various sorts, graduate student, and about 16 years as a faculty member.
And we met recently. You were here in Wisconsin, Society of American Foresters here in Wisconsin was a co-sponsor on a tour looking at agroforestry practices. And I was really intrigued. You led a discussion about forest farming, which I think a lot of our listeners are going to be really, really interested in. Maybe a natural first question then, and it's one I kind of had on that day is, what is forest farming?
It's a great question. So let me just start with the kind of broader perspective. What is agroforestry? Agroforestry is this, we call it an intentional practice where we're integrating woody species with oftentimes annual or short-term perennial crops and sometimes livestock as well. Agroforestry is a practice that is as old as humankind. The term, however, is somewhat new, at least here in North America. We do have actually a National Agroforestry Center. That's a U.S. Forest Service kind of outreach and research institute to a facility out of Nebraska. And out of that center, we have 5 practices that are typically promoted in the United States. Forest farming is one of those practices. So some of the listeners might be more familiar with some of the other practices that are promoted. For example, windbreaks, riparian forest buffers, and a couple of the other ones. For example, when I met you back in Wisconsin in early June, they were promoting alley cropping and silvipastures. So forest farming is kind of the 5th practice. It applies largely to forested areas of North America. There are a couple of different ways I'm sure we'll get into that we can approach forest farming, but most typically it's thought of as there are existing forest lands on the landscape, and we're thinking about the integration of the silvicultural aspects with some of the understory cropping aspects. And so it's a vertically integrated strategy for managing the landscape. It involves different aspects, as we'll talk about, of forest management, but we kind of think about it a little more holistically and also pay attention to what's going on in the understory beyond just regeneration, for example.
I like that you started broadly, Eric, with agroforestry. And this particular part of it, forest farming, really intrigued Brad and I because it integrates parts of, the silvicultural practices that we use. And oftentimes we work with lots of different landowners. And it seems like this particular practice would really apply and interest a lot of landowners. So are there key benefits to this for private landowners and for the environment itself?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, I am actually in the forestry department. I teach a variety of different forestry classes to forestry students here. And one of those is agroforestry with a big component of forest farming. The way that I tend to look at it, and many people who are engaged in forest farming is a way to get people to think about their forest lands, maybe in ways that they hadn't thought about before, or pay attention to things that they hadn't paid attention to. So what I mean by both of those things is, for example, I often refer to a lot of these understory crops that we'll probably touch on, like ginseng and mushrooms and ramps, as gateway drugs, right? And I mean that in the good sense. They're a way to kind of hook you, if you will, on what's going on in the understory of your forest. Get you thinking about, why does this ginseng grow here? Why is it disappearing on my forest lands? Oh, the deer are browsing everything here, right? So paying attention more closely to the things that are happening in the forest understory. And so I refer to it as kind of a gateway drug to getting to know your forest lands, not just the overstory, but a lot of what the understory. And of course, the understory is, at least to some degree, an indicator of future conditions. And so to that degree, it's a good way to get people thinking about what they can do on their forest lands in the near term. We often talk about forest lands, at least in the Midwestern and Eastern United States, we're talking about a rotation time that might be your lifetime, right? So you might get a cut once in your lifetime, you might do a couple of thinnings otherwise, but that doesn't really engage people or get them very interested in going in and doing all of those intermediate kinds of practices or thought processes or investments that are necessary for once every century kind of harvest. So forest farming, even though we talk about some of these crops as being slow growing perennial crops, relative to, let's say, oak and hard maple trees, they're much more rapidly growing. And so they're a way to kind of get some shorter term income to derive, tax dollars, for example, to derive income that can be used towards those TSI, timber stand improvement kinds of operations, invasive species management operations, all of these things that otherwise, just become like another thing that I need to do to invest in something that I may not ever see a return on beyond my lifetime. So forest farming is a way to kind of get people thinking about in the near term what they can do to manage their forest land, and whether they, are around to harvest the timber in 100 years or not. You can make those baby steps towards improving the conditions and the composition of that forest land, right, in the near term.
I think what you said about having landowners become more aware of their forest, that probably applies to us as foresters too, because I've written lots of forestry plans, and oftentimes, we're looking up and we're not necessarily looking down and considering those within the plans themselves. So that's really interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. I have a talk that I sometimes give to strictly forestry crowds, like S.5 members, that is essentially called the stepovers, right?
Step
Because
over.
these are the things you step over when you're looking up at the timber. So, trying to pay attention to things that are under your feet, if for no other reason, even if you're not interested in something like ginseng as a crop, there's a lot that we can learn, right, from what's going on the herbaceous layer floor. So.
I think it's important too. I remember Greg, our colleague Julie Ballweg, used to talk about the economics of forest management and how important annual expenses or annual income can be in the long term when looking at a forest. And so this is a part of even the economics that I don't think a lot of us have really considered, is those other opportunities for income.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have done some economic modeling, published some of it in journals like Agroforestry Systems for different types of crops, developed enterprise budgets around some of these things. I won't pretend that everything pencils out, just like, if we were to plant a lot of timber species and wait a century, it's very difficult, when you add in inflation and discount rates and all these sorts of things to actually make it look attractive, right?
Right.
So you have to be careful about how much you invest, of course, in a situation where you might not realize any kind of income for 10 years plus. But there is a lot of potential to be making some sort of shoulder income, as we say. So things that maybe aren't your lifeline, but help to kind of pay, as I said, for some of the cost of land ownership, the mortgage, that sort of thing, as well as making investments in the forest land. So one great example of that is a crop that I've been working with for about 20 years, American ginseng. American ginseng is one of our best kept secrets here in the Midwest and the Eastern United States. It is a wild harvested species, has been one of our most important export species for 300 years. It is at this point arguably over harvested in many parts of the United States. And we kind of face this conservation challenge when it comes to the wild species, and also an opportunity when it comes to doing something like forest farming, because ginseng is one of the greatest examples of a plant that, as much as you can invest in growing it, so to speak, that is making beds and doing all kinds of horticultural activities, it often performs best in what we call wild simulated system. So it really is about the intentionality more than anything, making sure that you are planting seeds, that you are protecting it from deer, that you are not over harvesting it, right? So I always say that forest farming first and foremost starts with intentionality, and then secondly moves on to reciprocity. And so in that regard, it often has roots in indigenous agriculture and land management, where we are thinking about the whole forest. We are thinking about it for a variety of different uses, some of which may be economic, some of which might be for pleasure, right? Harvesting mushrooms and ramps for your own benefit and culinary source, right? And so it's one of those things where instead of just strictly going in and exploiting the resource, thinking about how we manage it and how we can be, stewards of that resource. So it's not very different than many of the listeners of this podcast probably think about in terms of hardwood management. We're always thinking about, or should be thinking about, not how we take the last sugar maple off the land, but how we turn that sugar maple into a crop tree that seeds in that sugar maple that we want in the future, right? And so forest farming is oftentimes an economic activity that doesn't take a whole lot of investment aside from intentionality. And you can actually earn quite a bit of money with a crop like ginseng just by being cautious and being a steward.
That's really interesting because, in forestry, we have evolved to go through periods of heavy extraction of our timber and then realizing that we need to manage that timber to maintain it sustainably. But we haven't often thought about the understory in the same way. And that's what you're saying is being very intentional, recognizing what you have, what those populations are doing, and then taking steps to manage and sustain them.
Absolutely. So the way I think about forest farming is I often speak about it as being a continuum of approaches. So we have, all the way on one side, a strictly exploitative kind of mentality that we're just going to go in and, to borrow some terminology, high grade an area, right? Just take the best, leave the rest, and not think twice about what we're doing. And on the other side of things, we get into the plantation, right? Where we are strictly establishing something and managing it. And in many cases, it wasn't even there to begin with. Forest farming usually lies in the middle of that continuum. And so we have, as I just mentioned, a practice we call wild simulated, where we're going to manage and grow the species as if it's wild, or if it's already occurring on the property, we're going to steward that wild population such that it may eventually look a little bit more like a cultivated or managed population over time because it grows in size and numbers and health and vigor and so on. And then we have between wild simulated and this kind of cultivated or plantation style, we have something called woods cultivated or woods grown. And this is the idea that we're going to borrow some practices from horticulture and apply them to the forest land, but not entirely. And so that brings up, a point that I should note that forest farming, although it sounds like an intensive practice, it's not always intensive. It is more intentional. And so oftentimes, when you think of farming, it's this idea that we're going to convert the understory of the forest to this monocrop of ginseng, for example, as I just mentioned. And while some people do that, and that would fall within what we call woods cultivation, a lot of the time people are somewhere in the middle of that wild simulated, maybe going in and tinkering. What I mean by that is sometimes we'll do some site improvements, and that might involve removing some invasive shrubs and things of that nature. But it's this idea that there's a middle ground, as it's referred to, right? A lot of the time I work in the field of ethnobotany, and we talk about how people manage plant populations in a global and historical sense. There's a middle ground between what we would call wild and cultivated, and forest farming fits right into that middle ground. It's this intentional management and stewardship of populations.
That intentionality seems like it differentiates everything we're talking about here from just simple foraging, right? Like when I go out, it's like Christmas every day, right? It's like, hey, check it out. And then you take what you can, and then never over exploiting. But this is kind of maybe not necessarily Christmas, but more like just planning for a regularity over time or having different intentions.
Absolutely. Again, there's a lot to say is similar here to silviculture. Is just, trying to encourage populations and high quality populations of species on a particular site where they grow well is really at the heart of forest farming. So the first thing I always tell people to do is, observe your forest land for at least a year and get to know what's already growing there, and where the water flows, and where the deer are coming in, and where the invasive problems are occurring, and all that sort of stuff. Get to know the forest land, because what we again are really talking about is this idea of reciprocity. We're not going to go in and just start removing things. We're going to go in and start managing things. And in that regard, again, very much like well quality and well planned silviculture.
Eric, I just want to make sure I get those three different kind of approaches correct, because I think that's a neat way of understanding them. And you said wild stewarded is when you have plants that already exist and you're trying to be intentional about how much you harvest and all of that. Whereas wild simulated, that's where you might be actually employing activities to allow that plant to spread or to propagate. You mentioned like moving seeds or removing invasives, that sort of thing. And then all the way up to woods cultivated, where that's where you would be using some of those more, agricultural things we think of as agricultural practices. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's largely right. The only qualification, or I guess caveat, I would put out there is I come from a background where even foraging and wild stewardship involved the planting and management of propagules, right? So really when we talk about wild simulated, and everybody has different lines in their head, where this falls.
You're right.
But with wild simulated, oftentimes we're talking about augmenting what's there.
Okay.
So that might be using biomass to produce things like shiitake mushrooms on that forest land, right? While growing populations of ramps and ginseng that are already found there. So wild stewardship and wild simulated, a lot of people don't differentiate between. But for my purposes, I often think about wild simulated as involving a certain amount of augmentation of populations, right?
Okay.
You're bringing things in that aren't already there, for example.
And as you said, it's a continuum of sort of intensity. So
Absolutely.
where you draw the exact line probably is a little different for everybody.
Absolutely.
And I suppose it's going to depend on every site is going to have different species present, so some species on that site might be stewarded one way. Some might not need that because they're going to be in lots of different places. And so that brings us to like these examples. So you mentioned ginseng, which I think some of our listeners will be familiar with. What are some other examples of forest farm things that might be either common in the eastern United States, or maybe people are looking at a lot more here?
Okay, well, to answer that, let me kind of give you the big picture here. So, when we talk about forest farming, as I mentioned at the outset, usually we're starting with existing forest lands and we're going to be doing some sort of management of that understory for different species of interest. Forest farming, however, does in some cases involve open field conditions where people are trying to establish a forest, right? And so oftentimes you hear about food forests, for example, as being an example of a forest farming application where someone's got a backyard or a small acreage or a community food garden or something like that, and they're planting trees to create vertical structure, and they're going to grow things in the understory for a while, and maybe they'll transition it to something else once that canopy is established, and you need more shade tolerant species. So that is, a type of forest farming that starts in open field conditions. In those conditions, you can grow just about anything that you want that will grow on the site, right? You'll start in one place and you might end up with a whole different set of species composition, even in year 10, depending on the species you choose. So the other way of approaching forest farming is when you have an existing forest land, and we're going to, just like we would manage a forest, we're going to look at the existing composition that we're given by history, by past land management, land use legacies, and so on. And we're going to try and identify what we would call non-timber forest products or specialty forest products of interest. And there are a variety of categories that we can think about that we might be interested in. So we have these edible plants and mushrooms that we might be interested in, right? So in that category, we have things like morel mushrooms, ramps or wild leeks, for example. We have medicinal species. So ginseng, which I already mentioned, is a great example of something that people are forest farming throughout the eastern United States. But other things include a whole host of medicinal plants that we work with that are bought and sold from North America into both domestic and international markets. And some of these things might be familiar to listeners, like golden seal, bloodroot, black cohosh, blue cohosh, false unicorn root, and so on. So these are things that are currently wild harvested or largely wild harvested that have not only conservation concerns around them, but they provide opportunities for economic exploitation, again, in a reciprocal way. And they provide opportunities for something that I hope we get to if we have time. This idea that we do have a variety of native crops that are found in North America that we've just never really delved into, right? So we kind of have set them aside for one reason or another. Ramps are a great example, and nobody's ever done any kind of breeding work or selection work or development work as a crop. So we have these things that represent potential forest crops that we can look at and develop. So oftentimes we start with these things that are already there. I should also mention there are other categories like the floral products. So people will oftentimes look for things that are found on their forest lands that could go into craft and floral markets. So fern greens, pine cones. I see people selling sassafras walking sticks and hickory walking sticks and those types of things. These are products that, in many cases are biomass that is not necessarily saw timber, right? That people are making use of. So we have these broad categories of non-timber forest products that we often look at. We look at what's on forest lands first and foremost. And then secondly, if you are interested in something that maybe isn't found on your forest land, we start to kind of think about where are the conditions on those forest lands that are appropriate for introducing a particular species. And we do these introductions, we usually rely on native species. So in the case of ginseng, for example, because ginseng has been so heavily exploited for 300 years, and because of past land management uses, for example, grazing on forest lands, clearing for agriculture, which is very common here in the eastern United States, many of these forest understories just don't have populations of species like American ginseng remaining. And so identifying where it grows and reintroducing it into those areas is also a strategy in forest farming. And so we get into terminology that oftentimes these days is referred to as things like assisted migration, right? Ecological restoration. So all these things are overlapping with forest farming. They're all got kind of shared interests. The Venn diagram, if you will, overlaps, right? So idea here is that there's a variety of products. If we're working with existing forest lands, we often try and pay attention to what's growing there or what could grow there, given past land use legacies. And we typically avoid, not altogether, but typically avoid things that are non-native because we don't necessarily want to introduce things that become the next big invasive species, right? Now, one final thing I'll say is frequently people come to me with questions like, I would like to grow elderberries on my forest land. And the answer I usually give is, well, you could do that, but I don't know why you would do that, right? So the point being is that many things can be grown on forest lands, but don't grow well there. They don't grow well there because they don't tolerate or produce very well in the shade, or because they become nothing more than a game plot for deer, for example, if you're just putting out all these fruit-bearing shrubs in the middle of the woods. So oftentimes that's where we talk about these food forests. I'd prefer that people think about planting elderberries and strawberries and that sort of thing out in the open with a mind of developing vertical structure over time rather than turning the understory of their sugar bush into a strawberry field because it doesn't generally end up very well.
Well, I think we were going to talk about that in a little bit, but since you brought it up, Eric, I look at this a little like or a lot like when we manage trees in terms of site and site conditions being so important. And so part of our assessment of a stand for the overstory has to be that habitat type, that soil, those site conditions. So I can see in this case with the understory plants, that is just equally or even more important that people choose that correct site.
Absolutely. Yeah, there is, we go down a rabbit hole talking about why these things grow together, but there's a lot of overlap between where you'll find certain species in the overstory and certain species in the understory, right? I've been mentioning, for example, American ginseng. One of the top indicators for American ginseng is sugar maple or hard maple in the Midwest and the eastern United States. And, there are a variety of reasons for that we could point to just in terms of topography and site conditions, including the richness of the sites, oftentimes with a lot of base cations, right? A lot of calcium, magnesium, that sort of thing. Frequently, we're looking at, some of the lower topographic positions or east or north facing slopes, if it's higher up on the slopes, or cooler, moister types of conditions. And ginseng likes those conditions as well. But furthermore, in agroforestry, we often talk about integration. And there's an integration of these things, right? And an interrelationship between these things. So in the case of sugar maple and ginseng, ginseng likes the calcium, but it only occupies typically the top 6 to maybe 12 inches of the soil horizon. So it doesn't grow very deep. So it can't access, if you will, that bedrock parent material unless it's close to the surface. But sugar maple roots can. And so sugar maple will mine that calcium, bring it up into the foliage. And of course, calcium is used in making cell walls in the leaves and is not completely pulled back at the end of the growing season. And so you get that annual leaf fall that tops off the duff of the soil that is calcium rich and tends to break down, thereby feeding the ginseng, right? So it's a fertilization or a fertility cycle. So, there's a lot of overlap where these things grow just because they like the same site conditions, but there's also a lot of integration and interrelationship between these things that, again, becomes kind of the gateway drug that I referenced earlier. Once we start paying attention to why the ginseng is growing here, but not over here, we start to unfold and unpack these relationships.
When we think about some of these sites, we're working with, say, maybe not those rich mesic sites, where we have lots of water, lots of nutrients. Maybe we're getting into the slightly xeric. Does that impact how we might think about like the species or even the capability of the site for forest farming?
Absolutely. Yeah, again, very similar to silviculture. We think about, I'm looking out my window right now. I'm in the Valley and Ridge physiographic province of the eastern United States. Where I'm sitting down at the base of the ridge is where we find walnuts and sugar maples and all that sort of rich kind of site stuff. And I look up towards the top of the ridge. We've got chestnut oak up there, at best red maple and black birch, very thin sandstone up there. It's a site that does not grow ginseng. It wants to grow things like blueberries, for example, where the soil is acidic, right? And it doesn't have very much in the way of bases. So that's why I say that when we think about forest farming, just as we would with the overstory composition, we're going to look at what the site can provide first and foremost. We're going to pay attention to what's growing there. Or as I mentioned, because of land use legacy, we'll try to intuit what could be there. And oftentimes we're going to be looking at the trees to give us a sense of, what that understory has the capability to produce.
Eric, you mentioned a couple times this idea of establishing vertical structure and that some of these plants are companions and can grow together. So is somewhat of the idea to figure out, well, which of those plants sort of go together, but to be able to farm multiple species on the same acre in terms of creating sort of layers or structure in that forest.
Yes, absolutely. So, that's where this idea of forest farming, takes its roots in agroforestry. We're thinking about this layering of the landscape. So we've got some sort of longer term perennial woody layer. And by the way, in some agroforestry practices, that could be simply a shrub layer. I've seen agroforestry of sorts in California that was grapevines with echinacea planted in between it, right? So you've got this woody component that creates a little bit of a vertical structure. And then below it or amongst it, you're trying to grow other things. And, things that play well together is what we're aiming for, right? So I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with this idea of allelopathy, that these trees, overstory trees, can produce chemicals that may be detrimental to understory species. And that's something that we have to pay attention to, for sure. And, the thing I always point out is all of these species are producing these secondary metabolites and releasing them into the soil, right? So it's not just walnut, it's all kinds of species. And that often is kind of what we're observing when we do forest farming, is we're looking where these things are growing and trying to intuit or put together with the science that we have available to us why a species is found in one place and not in another place when they might look exactly the same, but the overstory species are a little bit different, right? Maybe it's the secondary metabolites, or in the case of oaks will often produce a leaf that is thick, leathery, and resists degradation, at least very quickly. And so it can form these very thick, matted layers on the forest floor. And that prohibits the growth of certain species that could otherwise grow on a site because they just can't get up through that duff layer, if you will. So thinking about how the vertical supports the understory and how the understory not just tolerates, but often thrives in the company of that overstory is usually what we try and do. And we're often looking towards Mother Nature to plant communities. Some people call it the native present vegetation. That's a permacultural term as kind of our benchmark for what we're trying to achieve, right?
Looking for continuing education credits? Check out the Silvicast webpage for more information. And now, back to our show. So thinking about, like, say, here in the upper Midwest, we've had a lot of grazing. And in fact, some of the species that we may be working with further east aren't really present here. So you mentioned that we don't really want to work with non-native species, but there's always that line there. Like, it's not super exotic, but it's not right here, but it could be nearby. Are there guidelines, or is there a way you approach that? Like where, okay, maybe we are going to try something different. So what do you keep in mind when you're doing that?
Yeah, well, I work in my role here at Penn State. I work a lot with gardening communities too, master gardeners and that sort of stuff. And of course, many of us are aware that non-native, what we would call invasive exotic vegetation, is rapidly changing the landscape of many parts of North America, particularly the eastern United States. And one of the things that I encourage people to do is just simply start with, trying to identify things that are already there that they're interested in. But if not, to not go the pendulum the other direction and start just bringing in anything. But pay attention and think about and do your homework on what you might want to introduce. Many so-called beneficial species in the past we now recognize as being problematic species from a land management standpoint. So, for example, autumn olive, Elaeagnus umbellata, I'm sure is familiar to a lot of folks. That's a wonderful shrub. I know some people are going to wince at that, but it really is. It fixes nitrogen. The fruit is edible. It's highly nutritious. It's a great pollinator plant. And it actually will fade if it gets topped out with too much canopy, too much shade, right, from a site. So, that was introduced by and large in many parts of the eastern United States for biodiversity and wildlife habitat improvement, right? And so oftentimes we may not recognize that we are the problem. We're bringing in things that seem like this is the next best thing. And then, generations later, people are like, God, why did they introduce this thing, right? We call that the lag effect, right? The lag phase effect. So I want people to at least think about, pause, and consider before they introduce things on the forest lands. Do a little Googling. What are people saying on garden forums, right? Are people reporting this thing naturalizes all over my property, right? That should be a buzzword that maybe you don't want to introduce it. A great example of this is shiitake mushrooms. So shiitake mushrooms are not from North America, but don't readily naturalize in North America, right? So there are a couple of strains that have been developed, Field and Forest, which I believe is out of Minnesota, Wisconsin region. They have patented one of their own varieties that naturalized on their own woodlands. But generally speaking, shiitake mushrooms are not something that we would consider to be an invasive species. They're not readily colonizing wood everywhere and starting to spread everywhere and becoming a problem, right? And so just because something is not native to North America does not necessarily mean we shouldn't plant it or establish it or work with it, right? Many of the things we grow are not native and not problematic, by the way. So I take that kind of pragmatic approach. of using a little bit of caution when you're going to introduce, ask around, check around, talk to people who are doing forest farming or have been practicing or permaculture or horticulture, look around online, Google the species, that sort of thing, and see what people are saying. But by and large, if we just kind of focus on the things that are found in North America, we still have a great palette of species to choose from. And so that's why we start there.
I'm sorry, Brad, you got to stop encouraging golden oyster mushrooms.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not encouraging, but I am partaking of them. They're delicious and they're everywhere. So
Yeah. Well, and that's a great example, of a mushroom that has kind of jumped from being strictly introduced as a cultivated mushroom and now occurs in what we would call a feral stage,
yep.
or some people might call it a wild simulated or wild stewarded stage on forest lands. We don't know what the ramifications. To my understanding, people are starting to study that. Oftentimes we think about the implications of invasive species, especially fungi. The things that concern me and keep me awake at night are not necessarily decomposers or saprobes like an oyster mushroom, but instead would be something that parasitizes a living tree.
Right.
And, basically kills all of our oaks, for example.
Right.
Yeah. I just had to bring that up because Brad harvests a lot of those, or
yeah.
is always looking out for them. So,
well, we're taking them home every time we see them too.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Eric, both Brad and I, we take a pretty expansive view of silviculture. So we consider that management of forest vegetation for any purpose. And kind of what you're explaining here too is just making me think, we're oftentimes pretty tree centric. That's our history, but there's a more comprehensive way of looking at that forest and actually developing management within management plans that also address some of the understory species. So I'm just thinking about foresters working with those overstories and trying to manage them well. But if they want to also start to look and consider those understory species, what kind of silviculture are we talking about here?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know all of those relationships and kind of how they work.
Right.
In general, do some of our silvicultural practices with the overstory tie in well with the species that you're talking about here in terms of creating the right light environment, for example, or you mentioned the right species composition where there's compatibility. So how should foresters start to think about that is what I'm wondering.
Yeah, well, how many hours do we have for this podcast?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know it could be a very long topic, but this is kind of where the rubber meets the road for foresters because we're working with these overstories, but then if the landowner has objectives for these understory species, how do they make those things match up and marry?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And what I'm going to say is, of course, a lot of it, just like silviculture itself, it's a science and yet it's an art.
Right.
We don't 100% know what is going to happen. We're trying to set up the right conditions for what we hope is going to happen. And, so when it comes to silviculture and forest farming, these things are not diametrically opposed. In fact, they work hand in hand. So, the vertical and the understory that we talked about, managing a sugar bush to improve the conditions for that sugar bush, the quality of the trees, let's call them crop trees that we want to tap. And that is something that we can absolutely do and pay attention to the understory, for example, if you've got ginseng. But we do have to pay attention to what we're doing in the understory. And I don't think if you're a practicing forester, these days that that's not foreign concept to you. In other words, we are paying attention to regeneration oftentimes when we're doing our silvicultural kind of prescriptions. And so in the case of, let's say, managing the understory of a sugar bush to also produce ginseng, we're paying attention to the layout of the log landing, the log roads that we're skidding. We're looking at how much we're going to remove at any given time, right? We're paying attention to the invasive species that might march in from the edge of the woodlot into the interior once we start to open it up, right? And we're going to hopefully get that landowner a lot more interested in what's going to happen to that understory because of it, right? So they might not have a sense that that Japanese barberry that's out there next to the road underneath the power line is going to come on in, but we can raise their awareness because now they're paying attention to the understory of that forest as we're doing some management of that overstory, right? So we can get buy-in. And so that's why I say it's not a mutually exclusive practice, and it's a gateway drug practice in the sense that everything can come together if we allow it to. But we have to give everything that intention that I mentioned too. There are going to be some trade-offs, right? There are always trade-offs. For example, to make a timber stand improvement on many sites economically viable for a company to come in and do that prescription that's been put down on paper, we may have to give up a little more canopy than we otherwise may like to. But, as long as we're engaging with the, landowner, and we've got forest consultants engaged with this, we can manage things so that they develop into a nice overstory over time, even if we open it up quite a bit, right? So any type of silvicultural prescription is fair game, even a clear cut. It just depends on, the level of engagement and investment in that forest land and how much the particular crop, for example, that we might be interested in can tolerate with sunlight. And so in that regard, many of these plants we're talking about actually have gone through long periods of time of coevolution of what we call in the fancy academic world stochastic conditions, right? These conditions where the trees blow down, or let's say Native Americans punched a hole in the center of the forest to put a village food plot in or something of that nature. A lot of these species have co-evolved with this kind of what I call roller coaster of open and closed canopy conditions. So just cutting trees in and of itself does not necessarily wipe out a lot of the species we're talking about, or most of the species we're talking about, especially the long-lived, slow-growing perennial species. We may actually favor reproductive cycles in these species. So, for example, one of the long observations that you hear from ginseng diggers is that I always like to go in about 10 years after a clear cut and look underneath the blackberry bushes, because that's where you find all the nice big ginseng plants with big balls of berries on them. And the reason is that you can get that short-term shade produced by things like pokeweed and blackberries and some of the shrubs. And that's enough for ginseng and other plants to grow just fine. And because of that increased light level, they will actually shift into more of a reproductive mode because now they're able to capture more sunlight, they're able to send more carbohydrates to the root, and they're able to sustain more seed and reproductive output, at least for 10 or 15 years until that canopy really starts to close. So the only kind of hiccup in the system at this point really is the introduction of non-native exotic species, right? They have kind of changed successional pathways. And it becomes a little less predictable than it used to be to know what's going to happen if, for example, we do a group tree selection and punch a hole in the forest. Well, in the past, we would predict we might get some blackberries. And now we might get some multiflora rose if we're not careful, right? Or something of that nature. So, what has changed is just the cast of characters, if you will. We do have to be a little more cautious when we're doing timber stand improvements or harvests about what comes back in the years following those activities. We do have to be a little more careful about where we're going to put in those skid roads so that we don't end up introducing Japanese stiltgrass, for example, running up those skid roads into some of our nice areas that we're trying to grow ginseng into, right? But generally speaking, a lot of these plants are pretty hardy plants, just like the trees in our landscape, and they can tolerate quite a bit of disturbance. So forestry and understory management, in my mind, go hand in hand, and that's the beauty of forest farming.
You mentioned the engagement and investment. So you mentioned earlier the wild stewarded, the wild simulated, and the woods cultivated. So would that degree of like flexibility kind of shift down that spectrum so that at the like that wild stewarded, you could do all sorts of stuff, but it would be a little more confined at the woods cultivated end.
Yeah, yeah. Or another way to think about it would be we might have to approach a particular area after a harvest with a woods cultivated mentality. Because what we need to do is take a very aggressive horticultural approach. Need to keep the weeds out, need to
Yep.
keep our crop growing, might need to make sure that the deer are not munching on it by piling up brush, right? But as that canopy develops and we get some overstory, we can start to back off and we can move it more into that wild simulated mode where now it's a self perpetuating population that we're just trying to manage. We're planting seeds back, right? We're harvesting or thinning it rather than, kind of wholesale planting it and harvesting it. So it becomes kind of a spectrum of activities that can change over time.
I was just thinking when you were saying that, Brad, I was thinking about ecological silviculture, where you don't necessarily know all of the ecology and interactions with all of these plants, but if you could employ silviculture that was consistent with the natural disturbance mechanisms that are in that system,
Mhm.
that that probably would also match the plants in the understory because they've, as you said, Eric, they've co-evolved together. And I'm thinking of things like northern hardwoods with sugar maple and ginseng, and where you're looking at maybe small scale gap disturbances type of thing. But other systems with other plants may look totally different.
Absolutely. Yeah. So again, I'll just reiterate that forest farming to me really has its roots in indigenous land management practices throughout the world. I also work in agroforestry and forest farming in Central America, and it's very similar down there. In fact, that's how I became interested in agroforestry way back in 1998, doing some field work in Nicaragua and seeing how when people punched a hole in the tropical forest, they would plant their corn and beans and other desirable species, and then they would let some things volunteer, and they would over time intentionally select for and manage the succession on that site using the natural forest at the edge of that hole as kind of their compass, right? And I think more than ever, that's what we need, at least in the eastern deciduous forest, because of the amount of historic disturbance that we've had, because of climate change, because of the fragmentation and invasive species issues. We need to have more hands-on management, and forest farming is one way to kind of approach this forest land management where we're using the historic conditions, not necessarily as a museum for what we're trying to perpetuate forever, but just to guide what the potential of those communities are, the productivity that's inherent there, the diversity that's inherent there, what a ginseng population could look like had it not been impacted by 300 years of overexploitation, right?
Mhm. So thinking about that and thinking about restoration as a whole, and I'm guessing maybe the answer is, oh, no problem. But so prescribed burning, no problems with, say, like even plants in the understory, maybe short-term loss, but long-term we're going to be fine.
Yeah, I think, we're all starting to kind of try and wrap our brains around fire, at least here in the East, a little bit more and its role. And so I can't answer the question of no problem. I suspect no problem, but we've just not really studied it, right? We're starting to now reinvest in fire in the landscape in a state like Pennsylvania, for example, and
Right.
see what happens when you burn a particular landscape. Do we get oaks back? Oh, by the way, those understory mushrooms like chanterelles that grow with the oaks, does it promote those as well? Those are mycorrhizal species that grow on the roots of the oaks, right? So the idea is that fire probably could play a very good role and beneficial role in promoting a lot of the species we might be interested in growing in forest farming systems. As I just mentioned, chanterelles. We just don't have enough background with it, particularly here in the East, to know that.
I knew you'd bring up prescribed fire, Brad.
Uh,
Good job.
yeah, it's what we do, Greg.
So, Eric, again, I'm thinking in my role as a forester, and as I said in the beginning, I've often concentrated on the overstory and not necessarily paid as much attention to the understory and what was going on there, even though there may be landowners that have a high level of interest. in that. So I guess I'm looking at where does a forester start? Like what advice would you give them in terms of trying to integrate forest farming into management plans that they are working with landowners who have that interest?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have come a long way, first of all, with agroforestry in North America, just in my career, a couple of decades, right? When I first started talking about agroforestry and practices like forest farming, people's eyes glazed over. Like, okay. But, in 2 decades, we are now not only talking about these things, but we have cost share available. We have a National Agroforestry Center that is pushing out lots of resources. We have a American Forest Farming Coalition that is just now forming and chartered and going to be kind of a nationwide effort to pull together all the forest farmers that are kind of scattered around in these kind of regional enclaves. So we're moving in this direction where the terminology is not just familiar, but it's starting to come up more and more, and people are starting to think about it, and landowners are starting to request, from foresters that they start paying attention to the understory because they're interested. A lot of the landowners I meet might not have an opportunity to either take over or purchase forest land until they're in their 40s or 50s. And they're, in many cases, not going to harvest the timber in their lifetime. They're going to try and hunt there, recreate there, get some firewood there, and maybe they'll grow some ginseng or harvest some ramps or morel mushrooms and that sort of stuff. And so this is really where, again, we can meet landowners where they're at and kind of engage them where they're at, where their interests are around not just the thing that they're interested in, but how forest stewardship, leans into that, right? So how forest stewardship can help produce whatever it is that they're interested in, whether it's morel mushrooms and so on. We also then have now things like cost sharing available. So the NRCS is cost sharing practices like forest farming in many, many eastern United States and Midwestern states, Pennsylvania, for example. And so when we, look at the prescription for that particular practice for cost sharing, a lot of it is management of vegetation for what we would also consider desirable silvicultural conditions, right? So two birds, one stone. Sorry if some people are offended by that saying, but that's exactly what we're trying to set up. So now we have cost share, we have organizations, we have a National Agroforestry Center, and more we have younger extension that are coming up through the ranks that are either enrolling in some of the webinars that are out there or being taught in classes. I know a lot of my students have gone on here in Pennsylvania to be foresters, and they now have in their tool belt an understanding of agroforestry and forest farming that they can now pull out when the landowners are talking about, I'm interested in morels on my property, right? So to answer your question, I think a lot of things are moving along right now in terms of resources and awareness in many, especially eastern states. There is some awareness building in northwestern North America, maybe less so in the southwestern United States, but there still are some opportunities down there working with things like pinyon pines and so on. So, it's an idea that people can apply throughout the United States. It's increasingly cost shared, and it's increasingly becoming a topic of focus in a variety of different kinds of educational venues, right? Everything from webinars to SAF meetings to, landowner conferences.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also a woods awareness too that you talked about earlier and incorporating maybe some of these evaluations in your site evaluation and not just inventorying overstory, but what's in the understory. We're fortunate in Wisconsin to have a habitat classification system that looks at understory vegetation composition and relates it to site productivity. So our foresters are already familiar with that and looking at that, but it just seems like developing that awareness and incorporating that into our forest evaluation would also be really critical.
Absolutely. I'm here because I grew up in the forests of Western Pennsylvania. So my earliest memories are running around, days of pre-internet, all that sort of stuff, sometimes barefoot in the woods, and playing all day in the woods. That just sunk into my psyche. As I became older, one of the things that led me, my undergraduates from Idaho State University, back to Pennsylvania to study the forests here was this love for the eastern deciduous forests. They are very rich repositories of biodiversity. And so I think that forest farming is just a good way for people to just get reacquainted with the rich biodiversity that we have on our landscape. Even if they're not interested in doing anything with that ginseng, they should be aware that it's there, right? This is a federally listed species that's in need of conservation attention. It has tremendous opportunity as a health producing plant, as an economic commodity. And so it's just something that people should be aware of. It presents opportunities for them, if nothing else.
I'm kind of curious. We have foresters that work with landowners on forests and forests in general and forest products, historically has been one of those things. Is there I don't know if it's a forestry consultant that's developing that can basically kind of identify these opportunities for landowners, kind of work them through that process of getting it to market and maybe even identifying what markets they have available in an area?
I understand your question correctly. I would say right now it's kind of a patchwork
Yeah.
of kinds of resources and organized kind of effort along these lines. And really, it comes down to a lot of the individuals. So, I'm here at Penn State. I could point to individuals that are working in New York or at Virginia Tech that have kind of taken up the mantle of forest farming and are developing these types of resources. And so my friend and colleague, John Munsell, for example, at Virginia Tech, has been working to develop an app that helps to kind of, if you want to grow ramps, it's going to help, using Google Maps, identify which topographic places on your property either have ramps or could grow ramps, right? So the science is coming along, and as the science comes along, the resources are going to come along. And so a lot of the work we've been doing, my students and I, has been trying to figure out where and how you grow some of these forest farm crops. And not only that, what's in them so that you can maximize the quality, the healthfulness of it. So, a lot of this science is still kind of in its infancy, but as it comes along, we see more extension resources and more types of technology actually that's coming out that can help people.
Are there resources, Eric, that you would point to people now, extension services or such, that might have some of this? They can start to learn on this?
Yeah, I would say from a forest farming standpoint, there's a couple of organizations that people should be aware of that are established. Again, they're just part of the mosaic of what's out there, but one of them used to be called the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmers Coalition. That effort was started in 2016, and that was a partnership between myself at Penn State, John Munsell at Virginia Tech, and Janine Davis at North Carolina State, and a variety of different NGO partners. That has since transitioned after a couple of rounds of grants, NEFA grants, to a stand-up national organization that's going to be called the American Forest Farming Coalition. And they'll be launching a new website and so on. My understanding is sometime this winter into the spring, that'll be a membership-based organization. And what do you get for it? Well, you get a lot of networking and you get access to resources that you might not already be aware of. A lot of us have been doing this. As I said, I've been doing this for about 20 years. We've got all kinds of YouTube videos and things that, have been stacked up, but in many cases just are not pulled together in a single place that's accessible for people. So there are organizations out there like the AFFC that are coming along. Another one in my neck of the woods is the Northeastern Forest Farming Coalition. That was started through a SARE grant by some colleague who in Yale. And, that's in its infancy as well. I've also heard that there are some folks out in the Midwest that are talking about developing something along these lines. But, these are grassroots organizations that are starting to connect the dots. As they connect the dots, we're starting to see more organized kinds of events that bring people together for education, networking, and to solve some of the issues that we're trying to solve as we look forward at forest farming as a land use practice.
I think this is quote unquote, we planted some seeds today with foresters. And I think, if they can take this information and identify even these conversations to have with landowners where these might be possibilities or things like that, I think we're further ahead than we were before this conversation. So that's fantastic.
Thank you, Eric, for joining us.
Good conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yep.
It's been a pleasure.
It's that time again, folks. Brad, what's our word for this week in Silvictionary?
So first, I'm not giving up on Silvosaurus. Riding the Silvosaurus, I think, would be a great title for this. But in any event, talk about the Silvictionary. Today, we're going to double up. We're going to have two words or a term.
Oh, we are?
And so our term is advanced regeneration.
Okay. And that's advance, not advanced?
That's right. So there is a difference. And how would you describe the difference between advanced and advanced?
I don't know. I was always taught that it was advanced regeneration, no D on the end.
Right. So I think the D is it's not necessarily a modification of the regeneration like just a simple adjective. So it's actually referring to a specific condition. And that's basically advanced regeneration is seedlings or saplings that develop or are present in the understory. And so this could be synonymous with advanced growth or advanced reproduction.
That's the SAF definition?
That's the SAF definition.
Yeah.
At a later date, I think we should go into maybe some modifications of that because certain places will start to talk about this, which I think would lead to maybe like us starting to talk about what is an established seedling. So it could be advanced, but is it established or is it free to grow? Or there are lots of other modifications, but that comes down the line.
Yeah, that's a complicated conversation about what is an established seedling, or at least how foresters use that term.
Yeah.
But advanced regeneration would just be more general of encompassing all of that natural regeneration that develops under that overstory.
Correct. So when we go into a stand and we're already looking at something that's there, no matter whether it's free to grow, whether it's established, it's all advanced.
Yeah, that's how I would define it.
Yep.
I think others might get into that more complicated, what's its ability to survive, and that kind of gets into that whole established
exactly
description.
Maybe we'll bring that up next time.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for that word, Brad.
Yep. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Silvicast. If you have ideas for future episodes or a question for the Dropbox, please let us know. You can reach us at UW-Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center by emailing wfc@uwsp.edu. Feel free to include a sound file of your question or comment if you like. We learn best when we wrestle with questions, so keep them coming.
And take care, everyone. And as always, thanks to our team, Susan Barrett, our editor-in-chief, Joe Rogers, our IT master, theme music by Paul Frater, and of course, UW-Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center.